So I'm going to keep I gave an introduction last night, and to save time, I'm not going to give one now, except to say that Erika is her best known introduction, as we all found out last night. Gave a really wonderful talk. And I think most people here have read her paper or are kind of familiar with her work, so she doesn't need the usual type of introduction. So the way we worked it out is that Erika will present a few remarks and show some slides, maybe about a half hour, and then the rest of it will be on us to come up with really great questions.
Okay. Should we go around the table and just introduce ourselves?
I'm sorry, actually, that's what we usually do. So,
Nathan Ekstrand. I'm the Secret Fellow for this year.
My name is Yolanda Hernandez, and I'm an adjunct faculty at Pitt.
I'm Stephen Hollenbeck, and I'm in the philosophy program at Duquesne, graduate program.
Eric Garrett. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies.
I'm Greg. I'll be starting in the history department, but I sit in on a lot of philosophy classes, including Professor Evans' current one.
Maureen O'Brien from the theology department and the Seeker steering committee.
Great. So after I finished Memorial Mania, which was published in 2010, and even as I was writing it, I started to think about issues of vandalism, cultural vandalism, permanence, which have sort of continued as a sideline and had this great idea, hey, let's write a book on vandalism, cultural vandalism in the history of America. And that was prompted by this. When the monument of Saddam was taken down during the invasion of Baghdad, and we'd seen similar sorts of images of the former Soviet Union tearing down statues of Lenin and Stalin. You know, there's this assumption, I'm going to show images of all of this, other people do this, not in the United States. And then I started to realize, wait a minute, and people have been feeding me scraps and bits of historical information about our own history of cultural vandalism. So I wanted to sort of do a project that would be about, once again, critiquing the American exceptionalist story. And then I started to think about why, and sort of the mutability of memorials and monuments and public art in general. And then I started to think about the ethical terms of cultural vandalism, good, bad, etc. So let me just run through a bunch of this stuff right now. So the essay really has been commissioned, the one you read, for the Black Belt Companion to Public Art. And I've been writing about public art for decades, and I'm tired of just writing, well, here's a public art story, and here's what happens, and I wanted to do something new. So they said, okay, you can write about the afterlife, sort of, in terms of public art's permanence. So I'm interested in episodes of vandalism, episodes of removal and reciting, asking, what are the ethical and political implications of public art's damage and destruction? Is it legitimate to erase or revise markers of history and culture? Do these kinds of acts constitute public dissent? And are there alternatives to public art's defacement and destruction? Here are some great examples. Alice Aycock's project that she did in New York sort of fits in with this idea that I have, that public art is essentially processual, equivocal, ambivalent, even when, as is often the case, it is built to be immutable, built to be permanent. And I think that attaches to the second notion, which is the meaning of public art is certainly not inherent or eternal, but it's really dependent on a variety of cultural and social relationships, and it's subject to the intangibles, if you will, of shifting publics. And shifting public dynamics, including their political interests, their social interests, their feelings, etc. So it's interesting to think about public art that contradicts or violates contemporary understandings of appropriate attitudes and beliefs. Violates or gets in the way. I mean, it doesn't have to stand out in real violation. And those projects may be defaced, despoiled, removed, recited, dismantled, or in this case with Alice Aycock, simply forgotten and sort of left to rot. So this was a public art project that she did. It's about 80 feet tall aluminum helix, 12,000 square foot rooftop space. So at the top left, you can see what the project was. It looks sort of like a roller coaster. And it was conceived as the public art jewel in a public art refurbishment waterfront revitalization project. So you know where you take the tram in New York to go from where Bloomingdale's is over to Roosevelt Island. This is near where this is located, by a former waste treatment plant. So they were going to take this whole area and do this, waterfront revitalization project. But the anticipated endowment for this revitalization never came through. So if that's what it looked like, that's what it looks like now on the right. Sort of there. I've walked through it recently and I thought, God, this feels familiar. But there's no signs, there's no explanation, and it's pretty rusted out. Part of the process of theorizing public art, and this is a field that demands theory. It is sort of at the historiographic level. I think includes developing a critical vocabulary that sort of frames all those questions that I have, but also defines certain meta terms or keywords. So for me, and this of course is coming out of Raymond Williams and the structure of feelings and sort of pioneering analyses of the shifting meanings of words over time. The words I'm most interested in are vandalism, removal, relocation, and destruction. Let me give you some examples. Here's a great example of vandalism. And vandalism is typically defined as the damage and destruction of property. It is considered illegal, and it can be considered a crime. I'll show you an example of a felony vandalism charge in just a minute. So it's important to keep in mind that vandalism specifically refers to the damage and destruction of cultural property. Tagging murals, tagging statues. This is that Spartan statue at the University at Michigan State, which University of Michigan folks come over and vandalize. It can also be politically motivated, a calculated act of political agendas. We'll talk in a minute about more Columbus statues. This is, if the Philippines would say, oh, this isn't a political act since it was done long after Ferdinand Marcos left the helm. On the other hand, who knows, it's, I know, isn't that a creepy picture on the right? Yeah. And then there's Banksy. Okay, so Banksy is this very well-known now street artist. So if vandalism is most often understood as the damage and destruction of cultural property, or property in general, this means that unsanctioned public art, like this kind of street art, may be considered vandalism. So these are pretty good examples of some of the work that Banksy has done in Bristol and Banksy has done in London. On the other hand, what's Banksy up to? Banksy may be up to the rejuvenation of public space, trying to raise consciousness about certain issues. I think that's certainly the case with slave labor. And slave labor, depicting a kid hunched over a sewing machine making Union Jack bunting. This is an example of trying to raise public consciousness. It doesn't really matter because it's outside the art market. It's located on other people's property. That's vandalism. Until Banksy becomes an artist and the projects, the space, the material become art market valuable. So slave labor here was removed from its public wall in North London and then sold at private auction for £750,000. Now, New York Mayor Bloomberg called Banksy a vandal when he came to New York and did a bunch of projects. But, in the art world, Banksy is money. So much so that this most recent example of the vandalism of Banksy is interesting to think about. I just saw this morning, this is on the left, Banksy's Girl on a Swing. Pretty well-known piece that he did in Los Angeles, vandalized just a couple of days ago, and that's what it looks like now after the vandalism on the TMZ site, if you're interested. A guy named David William Knoll, which kind of freaks me out because I taught a kid named David Knoll at CU Boulder. I'm like, oh no, who was in art, has been charged with 4 counts of felony vandalism, which could be up to 5 years in prison. And why? It's interesting to follow the comments following the reporting because they're like, wait a minute, why isn't Banksy being charged? And then again, according to the rules of vandalism, because the people on whose wall he did his street art love it, and they never press charges. This for them is an enhancement of their cultural property or their property, and David Knoll destroyed that. So, all public art is ultimately vulnerable. That's sort of the definition of public art. Often placed outside, completely open to the elements, subject to wear and tear. So that's also something we need to think about when we use the word vandalism. This is a nice example of folks trying to go out and conserve stuff that's placed outside. But, you know, if the Dubuffet, which is located in the Netherlands, is not much different than being here in Pittsburgh, right? I mean, when you're outside, you're subject to the kinds of wear and tear that will break down and make your work vulnerable. Vulnerable, and I talk a little bit about this in the paper more, but I'm not a conservator, I'm just interested in those issues. Vulnerable to people, you know, this is a great picture from the 1877 inauguration of Rutherford B. Hayes, and you can see Horatio Greenough's statue of George Washington. This is the one where he's naked from the waist up, he's got the little toga thing going on. He's in the Smithsonian right now, right by in the basement by the bookstore. And thousands of people climbing on, sort of on top of, and you know, at one point even stealing the big toe of this statue. Cops are chasing them, trying to get the pieces back. Very fragile piece, situated outside, then it was moved inside. Here's another example. Robert Indiana's Love sculpture in New York is literally being loved to death. Now, I wouldn't call this malevolent vandalism at all. It's just kind of thoughtless. It's why we're told not to put our fingers on the bronze statues in the museum, because there's, you know, all kinds of oxides that damage bronze. So it's not particularly malevolent. But as I got thinking about this, I started thinking about, well, let's think about relics, souvenirs. So public art treasure taking is certainly another example of public art vandalism. My friend Larry Bird, who works at the National Museum of American History, sent me the little tiny picture we've got on the left. In the early 1800s, tourists going to Plymouth Rock were given little hammers to sort of chisel out a little piece of Plymouth Rock, which they took home in the form of the reliquary that we see on the left. This, of course, was a way to instill nation attachment, right? Just the way that we instill attachment to the church or attachment to any kind of belief system. Got kind of bad, however, as Plymouth Rock was, you know, substantially reduced in size. And the whole thing is a total mythical narrative anyway, so they stopped doing that. And we could talk about Plymouth Rock, but so that's treasure taking, and this is treasure making, sort of metal scrap vandalism, which I talk about. Prices for metals have soared in recent years, largely due to the little bit of metal that's used in everybody on the planet has an iPhone. Also what's inside of our computers. China is manufacturing all this stuff, so people are stealing bronze on any level, not just the public art that I'm talking about, but copper drain pipes, and we've had huge thefts in South Bend, I'm sure you have as well. So in 2005, someone stole this right off the artist estate, you know, they have videotape of the truck that pulled up and everything. This thing's worth millions. They probably got about $2,500 in scrap metal. Same with this project, another bronze piece, and you can see how they cut it off, just leaving the two holes there. And this was stolen out of London's Dulwich Park. Another example, somebody stole the bronze grills from the eyes, which are about the size of dinner plates. On the right, you can see the sign that people put on trees, "Bring our grills back," you know, award for the vandalism. Now this kind of profit vandalism or treasure making vandalism is nothing new. People have been melting down bronze statuary since ancient times, right? I mean, that's something to think about in terms of issues of permanence. When new regimes take over, they get rid of the symbols of the previous regime, melted down, etc. And I was particularly intrigued with these photographs that Pierre Jahan took during the Vichy regime, when about an estimated 1,750 public art works, pretty much dating from, let's say, the 1860s through the 19-teens, were taken, and melted down in exchange for economic vouchers from the German government. So this was all about an economy of exchange. These are really interesting photos, I think, very eerie photos of the sort of stuff that has been vandalized for national purpose and wartime purpose. Public art great embodiment of what Bourdieu calls symbolic capital, the value, the utility, the power of both what it represents and the environment it occupies. Its permanence, its presence, lend legitimacy, obviously, to particular social, cultural, and political conditions. And when that symbolic capital is deemed illegitimate, it is removed, reconsidered, recited, destroyed. Now, I think there are two categories of this kind of symbolic vandalism. One, state-sponsored or officially mandated, and the second, individual or public performances which are often contrary or counter to the state. The removal of the statue of Saddam here is a great example of state-sponsored or officially sanctioned public art vandalism. It was originally touted as a spontaneous citizen uprising. Later it was determined in a nice piece of investigative journalism that the whole thing was a calculated talent, sort of target of opportunity by some psyops teams that were on the ground in Baghdad. This whole thing is sort of organized, but it's hard to pull down a bronze statue. It's almost sort of, here guys, use these tools. Here, I'll give you the rope. I mean, we've seen kind of funny images of people hitting statues with slippers, right? This has become one of the iconic motifs of they hated the statue so much they hit it with slippers. That's not how you take a monument down. So, you know, in the background, something else is going on. Another good example is the state-sponsored destruction of the Pearl Monument in Bahrain in 2011, which had become the meeting place in Bahrain for Arab Spring revolutionaries. And it's such an odd thing, this towering monument with this pearl in the middle of it, sort of an amalgamation of the sort of the Gulf oil states coming together at this moment in 1982 to create this memorial. And then once people begin gathering and protesting against the state says, we've got to get rid of this monument. We have to get rid of this revolution. And so on the right, you can see the destruction of the memorial. So as I said, this prompted me to think about, so what have we done? And one of the earliest things we've done, and I'm not even going back as far as the destruction of totems and kivas and all sorts of other things, but one of the first things that we did on hearing about the Declaration of Independence, which was read a few days after it happened, this is about July 7 or 8, I think, in New York, is tear down two statues that the Brits had put up, including this one of King George III. So this took place in Bowling Green in July of 1776. And there has been centuries of this sort of cultural vandalism. The vandalism of the Columbus Fountain in front of Union Station in Washington in 2002, 510 years resistance. This fountain has been hit numerous times, which is kind of interesting. I mean, Columbus is the favorite son. There are hundreds of Columbus memorials, markers, monuments placed in America from the 1880s through the 1920s. Concurrent with the Knights of Columbus being organized in the 1880s and the sort of recovery of Italians, claiming Italians as American citizens too. So you've got Columbus as the, oops, what have I done here? Oh, come on. We're now at the end. Come on. You're seeing everything backwards. Oh, I'm almost there. Okay, so there were lots of Columbus statues created.
Where's the sign?
There you go.
Okay, lots of Columbus statues created. And then today, rather than being perceived as that explorer, he's more of an exploiter. So we've got all these public art projects, protests, parades, etc. And Columbus statues, not surprisingly, are often vandalized. So just a quick run through. This one in Pittsburgh in 2010. This one in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Kind of shot through the eyes there, kind of like that. Boston, first they cover him in paint, then they take off his head. And it's all over the Americas, this one in Caracas, being torn down from this pedestal. Okay, obviously, symbolic vandalism of public art articulates struggles over state and self, particularly during moments of regime change. So I can think of no better example than the regime change in Afghanistan, or the regime change in the Soviet Union, or the ongoing regime change in the American South today. Now, some in the American South claim that this kind of vandalism of Confederate statues, right, is heritage violation, sort of a hate crime against white Southerners, which means black people are doing this to white people's memory. But what's kind of funny about this piece, this is the vandalism of the Confederate Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, right on the lawn of the Montgomery State Capitol, or the Alabama State Capitol, is how the vandals black-faced the Southern soldiers here, and then wrote NT 111131. So for weeks, police and others were, researching the Bible, trying to figure out what does NT 111131 mean, finding nothing until some bright person said, oh, for God's sake, this is Nat Turner, who was executed on November 11, 1831. And obviously somebody has an historical sensibility. And he was executed for his leadership in a slave rebellion. So this is, I think, sort of interesting piece of vandalism. And the kids who did this were white college kids. So this wasn't, heritage violation so much as a snarky historical comment. Here's some others. Vandalism on statues of Jeff Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America. I mean, obviously these memorials are being vandalized today because the ideology that they embodied, the Southern Confederacy's racist violation of human rights, is not considered legitimate or valid today. And having these memorials and monuments present in public space is a sore spot. It certainly challenges what to do with public art in the South. And I think that by putting slave owner on the Jeff Davis Memorial here in New Orleans, it brings slavery into the conversation in ways that it simply hasn't been there before. On the one hand, a lot of this cultural vandalism fits with anthropologist Alfred Gell's argument that certain forms of iconoclasm are powerful forms of individual agency. And I don't entirely disagree with that. Michael Taussig, also in anthropology, argues that vandalism helps unmask the secrets of power and authority. As he puts it, defacement is like enlightenment. It brings insides out, unearthing knowledge and revealing mystery. So for these writers, cultural vandalism is a politically transgressive act that's aimed at destabilizing official narratives. This is another example. In the early 1970s, somebody carved out the word savage on this Civil War memorial, or actually Indian and Civil War memorial in the plaza in Santa Fe, to the heroes who've fallen in the various battles with savage Indians, and then they carved out the word savage. And to this day, that's what this looks like, although there are some text panels that have been added. So I became interested in these acts of vandalism and also cities allowing them to just sort of stay vandalized. And I stumbled on lawyer Sonia Keitel's discussion of what she calls semiotic disobedience, that this kind of vandalism can be seen on legal terms in terms of semiotic disobedience. So vandalism has never been viewed as legitimate speech in the United States. Because it's associated with property. Vandals are property outlaws who transgress laws pertaining to property ownership. And I think it's really important to understand that property ideas about property, have completely colonized our understandings of public art and culture in general today. So public art is first and foremost, public property, fixed, permanent, unchanging. And that means it's subject to the protection of property laws. And I think that's a pretty problematic view of public art if we also understand that public art is, like publics, processual, contingent, and mutable, fluid. Recognizing this, the vandalism of pieces like Santa Fe's memorial was left in place by the city of Santa Fe, by the city council there. They did add this plaque. that explains, quote, monument texts reflect the character of the times in which they were written and the temper of those who wrote them, and didn't pay much attention to the actual historical conditions of what this represents. But it's something to think about. Other artists and publics often deviate on these two views of public art, cultural property versus public expression. This is Prada Marfa, and this is a permanent piece of public art that's been repeatedly vandalized since it was first installed about 45 miles from from Marfa, Texas, which has become this hip sort of art town in Texas. And Michael Elmgren and Ingmar Dragset, who are public artists from Norway, Sweden, created Prada Marfa, which looks like a box just placed down, a Prada store in the middle of the West Texas desert. It was originally outfitted with Prada boots and Prada shoes, and you would look in the window and you couldn't get in. It was a joke, right? A cynical joke about West Texas and Prada. Vandalized from the get-go. As you can see, within a week, somebody had written dumb on the side of Prada Marfa up there on the left. Here's the most recent vandalism of just a couple weeks ago by an artist who calls himself 9/27, 1977. Bet we can figure out what that means. And who left a note saying that the installation had served its purpose. Prada Marfa had served its purpose. But today, in 2014, with, quote, global war, entitlements, corporate austerity, poverty, destruction of nature, this project no longer measures up. In an interview with a reporter, the artist who has been arrested, said he was disappointed that his counter public art, his counter installation, which included painting the walls light blue and leaving defaced copies of the Bible covered with stickers of the Tom's logo, the shoe company in California that prides itself on being very politically liberal. You buy a pair of Toms, we give a pair of Toms away to starving children in Ethiopia, was itself defaced because that shuts down the dialogue. So he was angry that his public art was defaced because it's shutting down the dialogue that public art like Prada Marfa is supposed to generate. Whatever. Although this was actually a temporary project, which I write about, not meant to last for terribly long, Elmgren and Dragset are furious about the vandalism of their public space, they've been threatening to recite it somewhere else where it will be appreciated, and I'm just amused by this entire conversation. Not so amused by the removal and the destruction of Tilted Arc, because I think this was really a calculated political response. The people who were in charge of the General Service Administration at this time hated the piece for exactly the reasons the piece was made. Richard Serra created this 80 or so foot long big hunk of steel in the middle of a pedestrian pathway so that people who came out of the buildings would have to circumnavigate this thing in an attempt to spark consciousness about how routed and prescribed our lives are, or circumscribed, if you will. Not a happy piece, not a well-liked piece, but after a couple of years, as often happens, it's sort of a piece. It's there. I've learned how to walk around it. But the GSA said it was inappropriate and had it removed. It's stored in a warehouse. Richard Serra declares this a dead child project. It can never be done again because it was specifically created for this site. So this is an example of the kind of reciting or removal, if you will, of destroyed art. This is somewhat different. Sometimes public artworks are not destroyed when they're removed or recited, although their original meanings and intentions are certainly altered. This is a sort of public art shrine. It was a public art shrine on the campus of Penn State. And following the accusations and the trial of all sorts of things, it was removed, particularly as somebody chartered a plane and take the statue down, or we will. It was flown over the campus. Sometimes public artwork is removed because it's being vandalized and people feel that it needs to be saved. This project by Bourgeois was just stupidly located in an area by Lake Michigan that had no relevance to Jane Addams. This is supposed to be an homage to Jane Addams, and was also pretty near a site of drunken guys and girls hanging out on the beach. So it was very subject to vandalism. So it's been removed, but now to a very private, kind of hard to get to locale where it will be safe. New Deal murals in the United States are often subject to removal. In the 1940s and 50s, they hated this mural because of the naked women. Today, they hate the mural because of the depiction of Indians. The GSA doesn't want to remove it, so they propose putting up a screen. So there will be sort of a screen when you walk into this space, and you can go behind the screen and take a look. Some disgraced monuments are recited to tell the story of their disgrace. So this statue, along with many others, has been moved to Grušas Park in Lithuania, probably about an hour or so away from its original location, and filled with all sorts of other Soviet era statues. It's a Communist Party theme park, in other words, which allows, I just love this comparison, instead of Lenin, we've got John Lennon, which was another public art piece. This was made out of sand, so it didn't last very long. Sometimes public art is destroyed on accidental terms. So here's a big Confederate monument in North Carolina, which some distracted driver drove into, it's created a huge conversation. Should we restore it? No, we really shouldn't restore it. That was then, we're not that. And then some people have demanded its restoration. Sometimes it's simply left to die. This is a project in Chicago. On the top left, you can see what the original project by Akanji looked like. It was called Fuller Clock. It had this huge metal hand that moved. The metal hand got stolen. The base is still there. There are benches there, but nobody knows what this is. So it's this utterly odd, crumbling trash site. And then often public art is destroyed because of sheer intolerance. This is a part of the Living Walls project in Atlanta. And then because some neighborhood people thought that this was satanic, they demanded that it be painted over by state workers, which it was. Let me finish up by saying the intolerance that leads to public art's destruction is indicative of more dangerous kinds of destruction. And the cultural cleansing, if you will, of public art can be related to acts of social and political cleansing. And this is what Robert Bevan talks about in his discussion of Kristallnacht in 1938 in Germany and other highly symbolic acts of cultural vandalism. He observes the link between erasing any physical reminder of a people and its collective memory and the killing of the people themselves is ineluctable. The continued fragility of civilized society and decency is echoed in the fragility of its monuments. So that should prompt us to think about temporary public artworks, the kind of artwork that Christo and Jean-Claude created with the Extraordinary Gates project, which was up for just a few weeks in Central Park. Because temporary public art allows for lots of political sides, because they won't be there forever. It can be inventive, it can be aggressive, it can take sides. I like the Fourth Plinth projects in London. So there are 4 plinths, and this one on the left was always left empty because then they could never figure out what to put on it. This is in Trafalgar Square. So now it's become a source of temporary public art projects, hotly contested. Here we have one by Elmgren and Derek, the Prada Marfa guys. I love the Katharina Fritsch one. Hans Hacke, the political artist, just gained a niche, so his work will be going up soon. Here's another example of a pretty interesting temporary public art project by Raphael Lozana Hemmer. This is called Wiz Alto, or Alta, Loud Voice. This was commissioned for the 40th anniversary of the student massacre in Mexico City on October 2, 1968. And I had forgotten that this was just 10 days before the opening of the Olympics. When government troops attacked student protesters at a peaceful rally. We don't know how many died. The government says 14, some people say 300. There were thousands of people, and people report seeing trucks driving away with hundreds of bodies. It's never been officially investigated by the state. What Raphael Lozano Hemmer did was create a megaphone in the same plaza where the massacre took place. When it was utilized, when people spoke, when it was amplified, a searchlight beamed the voice as a sequence of flashes that were visible over a 15-kilometer radius and sort of lighting up the spot. in direct contrast to the media ban at the time and sort of in the present government denial of the massacre. And thousands of people eventually participated in this project over this 24-hour period. Hemmer works at Harvard. Krzysztof Wojcicki works at MIT. I don't know what's going on in Boston, but it's kind of interesting because they've got some of the more inventive temporary public artists working. Wojcicki has long been engaged in making temporary public art projections in which he projects images on public art, monuments, memorials, and buildings in order to create new reads, new understandings. And I'll end with this one. This is the Bunker Hill projection in South Boston, where people were holding photos of loved ones, husbands, children, partners who had been murdered. This is South Boston, the Charleston area. We've seen it in a couple of recent films with Mark Wahlberg. It's hardcore. It's also, as Wojcicki discovered, sort of closeted by a code of silence. So you don't talk about your pain, you don't talk about grief, you don't talk about gangs, and you don't talk about your children being murdered, except you have to, because otherwise this just keeps going on and on. So he used the side of the Bunker Hill Memorial, right, the Revolutionary War Memorial, to project images of people in grief, talking about what had happened to their families, in order to talk about the code of silence and the culture of violence in Boston, trying to get people to rethink their positions and ideas and habits. So I think that I'll end there. The paper is about all of these things that happen to public art, but it's also a way of trying to get us to think past property, because I think so much of the property angle is what is prohibiting public art's true contribution to a more enlightened or transformative public sphere.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now I'll just go around, questions, comments that people have. It's kind
It's a
of
little long,
discussion
sorry.
generate. No, it's still this plenty of time. So one quick bookend, actually something you already know, Erika, but about this distinction between something that's permanent and something that's processual, that it goes back to the beginning of the birth of the U.S. I'm thinking of Kirk Savage's work on monuments, and it turns out that at the beginning of right after the Revolution, the biggest topic, even bigger than slavery as an issue at that time, was between whether there was going to be a stone monument. The Federalists wanted a stone monument for Washington, and a guy, Congressman Nicholas, part of the Democratic Republican Party at the time, said, no, what we want is a blank slate so that everybody's opinion, so to speak, can fit on, which means processually you can keep changing that. So this opposition that you brought up, permanence versus processual, is there from the very beginning, a leading topic at the beginning of the U.S.
Yeah.
Just to show how far back the issue.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I just thank you very much. It's
Thank you.
Great paper and great speech last night. I had a question as far as how you see the artists themselves who are creating the projects involved with the ideas of permanence and kind of how public art plays within the sphere of memorials. Because there's a sense to me in which not only is it seen as property, but the artists themselves see themselves as creating property.
Absolutely.
When you're creating something permanent, like the Prada, it's a great example with the Prada store there, and all of a sudden it turns into something that you don't want changed. I'd say that sometimes with architecture too, the Folk Art Museum in New York City, that's been that debate. It's like, if you want to create something permanent, it seems very strange to create it in a space that is so tied to economics and the political sphere.
Yeah. I remember having a very bad argument with a colleague of mine who taught Renaissance art, and we were talking about the conservation of Leonardo's Last Supper, and I just said, let it go. She was horrified. We'd be letting so much of importance go. You say that for everything, and I sort of do. So I understand completely the engagement from the economic artist who's making property for income. Okay, it's their job. It's like somebody working in a car factory, or it's somebody making glasses or any other commodity. But is that really what we want art to be, or what public art can be? I'm certainly not arguing that everything should be temporary. I'm arguing for people to rethink the status of the commodity or the status of property. Some people are on board with this, some people are not. The problem too with a lot of temporary art is a degree of political engagement, which, let's face it, a lot of artists simply do not have. I just want to create, I just want to make. There's nothing wrong with that. And I just want to own, and I just want to buy. There's nothing wrong with that. But I'm talking about a different kind of art, if you will, and sort of opening it up to, or let's start having these conversations in art departments about what you can be when you grow up as an artist. You know, you don't all have to go to New York and try to get gallery representation. Maybe you should think in these ways as well. And I think that's true of art writers and others when it comes down to like copyright. Okay, yes, I write a lot of books. One could take the hard line about it's my copyright and I'm going to get royalties. Yeah, then you get into business and you realize there's no money. I'm not writing any bestsellers. So I've become really loose too about, you know what I want the most? I want to share my ideas. And if that means people are JPEGing or PDFing entire chapters and putting them, it's okay, right? So I'm very conflicted about it, but I'm open to all sides. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the presentation very much, and I'm really fascinated with the Banksy and the sort of street art movement, how it's sort of become, and it was part of this was that documentary, the exit through the gift shop, right?
Yeah.
But
who is Banksy?
Yeah. Well, but what I really liked about that was the whole how here's this sort of alternative, like anarchist, anti sort of establishment, form of sort of speaking to public space, and yet the commodification of it, and how when Banksy, I think you point out, was in New York, everyone's trying to steal those pieces, and just the ridiculous values of some of these is just to me that's just that irony I just find really fascinating.
It started even earlier with a guy named Keith Haring. And Keith Haring, I don't know if you remember him, but he was an artist in the 80s who would go down into the subways with magic markers and make, you've seen his work with the little kind of goofy looking figures. And people then eventually, Keith Haring would steal entire those subway posters or whatever he was doing because he got gallery representation and he's hanging with Andy Warhol and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And then you can go to the Warhol Museum and buy Keith Haring cups, Keith Haring t-shirts. But I've always felt that to be a contemporary artist, you have to keep one step ahead of the market. Okay, yeah, duh. I mean, modern capitalism is going to appropriate whatever it possibly can to make money. Your task as an engaged artist, if you want to go that route, is to constantly stay one step ahead. That is really hard to do the older you get. It's perhaps a young person's game, but I also think that's pretty, if we're going to live in this economic system, it's one pathway to figure out. The other pathway is just not play the game of the commodity. I'm working on a new book on 20th century American artists and religion, in which so many of them were influenced by Kandinsky's on the spiritual and art, in which he's talking about, look, to be a modern artist, to get away from commodity production and capitalism. And he's writing this in 1911. The spiritual is the inner necessity of the modern artist. And so I'm working with a group of artists who, they don't exactly succeed with that, but they're trying to think about making modern art on different kinds of terms than pure commodity production. Well, Wojcicki has to eat. He has to live. He has to travel. He's not cheap. He gets commissioned, and people pay him to do his projects. So
I'm sure he gets a nice salary from MIT too.
I'm sure he does. Yeah, but.
He's very good.
And of course, what are you talking about, Erika? Obviously, I've got the images, right? I mean, all of this is cataloged and archived. It's not like it's invisible. It's not impermanent, right? We've got permanent documentation of this material. It's for us, not necessarily for them, and that's a distinction to make. So, yeah, I hope I'm not completely confused about all of this, but I'm just trying to look at it in different ways. Yeah.
He was in Pittsburgh about 2 or 3 years ago and gave a talk, and I asked him, I said, would you feel okay if someone referred to your art as temporary graffiti? And he thought about it for a while and said, yeah, that'd be fine. So, yeah.
Yeah. Not temporary vandalism.
Right, temporary graffiti. Right.
Sure. Yeah.
couple of factual points. I think the great surge of Columbus monuments in the late 1800s was relevant to the 400th anniversary
Of
in
course.
1892, and the Chicago World's Fair was
Sure.
called the Columbian Exposition and stuff like that. And as far as the Confederate, there's a very interesting one in Alexandria, Virginia, which of course is right across from Washington, D.C. And it was put up there not long after the Civil War. And it has a Confederate soldier whose back is towards Washington, D.C. And his head is hung low and sort of in shame. And when it was erected in the 1880s or so, it also put the names of people from Alexandria, Virginia, who had died in the Civil War. All of whom were Confederate soldiers. So it's not only just a Confederate memorial, but it's memorializing these people. It happens to be in an area of town right in the city square, and it's been hit several times by automobiles and knocked down, including one as recently as 20 years ago. And every time it's been reconstructed. I think the one 20 years ago, you can start getting into the 1990s, and Alexandria not being south anymore, sort of being, suburb of DC. It's a lot of controversy. Way back when, because there was some prospect of building a road, like in the 20s or 30s, into DC or something like that, people in Virginia passed a law that prohibited its removal. So it's illegal to remove it by state law, which I think is very interesting. So that's it's another one that keeps getting, but it's been knocked down several times, and every time by law it has to be.
Yeah, but removal doesn't necessarily mean restoration.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So if it gets
yeah.
knocked down by a van next week, and then they find out that it's really hard to restore this for under $400K, there might be a conversation.
Right,
So-
right. But that's just one of the more interesting ones because it's been so.
No, I think there are quite a few little towns that are creating those kinds of laws to kind of set themselves up for the foreverness of their Confederate memorials. We'll see what happens. So, yeah, thank you. I don't know that, and I know Alexandria pretty well, so I'll go track it down.
I had remembered this, and when I sneaked in at the very end of your talk last night, hadn't known if you had brought that up, had heard some discussion about Confederate. I went back and very simple Google search Confederate Memorial, Alexandria, Virginia, and it'll just show
I will
right up.
definitely go find it.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
I'm a complete neophyte to this discussion, so this is, I guess, a curiosity question about your viewpoint on a couple of the examples that you put up there. One was the removal of the word savage in the savage Indians, and another plaque being erected, I guess, to say something like, this was conditioned by its time, sort of a statement. And the other being the naked women and the savage Indians mural with the screen in front of it to give people discretion over whether they viewed it or not, and I presumably, I guess, with some explanation. From the way you presented them, I thought you didn't seem to think that those were good ideas, and I was curious why not, simply because I thought, doesn't this set up a really good problematizing kind of discourse? This monument still exists, it's problematic for us today, isn't that worth talking about? Isn't that worth coming to terms with?
Sure. No, I actually don't have any problems.
Okay.
I think I would have had problems if Santa Fe had added the word savage back in.
Yeah.
It's an interesting story. So this happened in about 1973. And at that point, the city council said, fine, let's tear it down anyway. We hate this thing. We don't need any more war memorials in the Indian War, Wounded Knee, the whole bit. The National Park Service came in and said, if you take that memorial down, we will no longer fund X, Y, and Z around New Mexico. Oh, okay, so we got to rethink this. So it went through all kinds of iterations, and then the upshot was we're going to keep the word chiseled out, but we'll add some text plaque. So this is a good example of what we might call an additive work of public art. And the same, I suppose, with the Michel mural. And, those are hard to see anyway because they're in government buildings, but this is about staffers and folks who work in those buildings. And unless I'm wrong, that one might have been in the Department of Interior, where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is located. So I completely understand why people are having some issues with this. And ultimately, I don't care about the screening. It's not very pretty, to walk into a lobby and there's something over there on the screen in front. But you're right, they will have text panels, I think on the other side of the screen. You know, this is why there's a screen. This is the story, why this mural is here. This is our response. We're not tearing it down. We're not reciting it, which was another possibility. It's here. Let's have a conversation. So,
Right, which would seem a great educational
absolutely.
opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit to, you mentioned Taussig and the idea where vandalism might also be an unmasking of secrets at the core of power. And then that example with the Confederate statue that gets vandalized, and then the people that are in favor of the Confederate statues say, well, it's heritage vandalism.
Right.
And it's sort of set up as a hate crime against hate crime, from their point of view. And this actually brings up a real interesting issue, and to kind of put a frame on it, in my own work, which has a lot to do with speech, and particularly political speech, where politics, I understand, is which voices get heard and which get excluded. So if you have a political ideal that wants to include as many speakers as you can, there's always the problem about, well, what happens if you include the excluders? That is, those who try to set up a policy that would then exclude other people. You get the paradox of how do you exclude the excluders? And in my work, I try to work it out. Well, it's a long argument, but you end up affirming their right to be heard, but not necessarily be policy-making voices. But it comes up here too, because when for instance, with Taussig, he seems to be saying, look, it's okay to do vandalism on a piece of art if it's unmasking the secrets at the core of power. And that's sort of excluding the excluder, where the power is such that it's putting limits on what we can hear. Then it's legitimate to vandalize it in a way that will make a statement against that power. And that has a certain degree of sense, although it's messy.
It's really messy.
Yeah.
I mean, what about the Spanish colonialists who come in and unmask the secret of kiva power by destroying kivas, right? I mean, there's all sorts of ways that we define enlightenment actions.
And then that Confederate is the other, where we've got white supremacists that want to keep the Confederate. Right. And so they're saying, and in a sense you might say they're now a minority. Whiteness isn't a minority, but white supremacists in the sense of actually having a policy to exclude everyone that's not white. That's a minority point of view. So in a sense, it's got to be heard, but we wouldn't want it to become a policy-making voice. Mm-hmm. And so I think it sets up this whole issue, the ambiguity in all of this.
Well, I think this is indicative of a really important shift that's going on in the American South. Finally. I mean, I've been talking about this stuff for decades now, and I'm not a Southerner. I was raised in Wisconsin, but I remember we drove down to Florida once. We were in northern Florida, maybe 20 years ago, and I stopped in a small town, and there was a Confederate War Memorial. I said, War of Northern Aggression. What the hell war was that? My husband was like, oh God. I'm just stunned, given the shifting demographics in the American South, that these things exist, have existed, are still present. I'm not saying they should disappear. I would like to see more conversation going on about them. I mean, one of my favorite acts of vandalism was people going to NASCAR, African Americans going to NASCAR and wearing Confederate flags as bikinis, or appropriating Confederate symbols in way by blacks and in ways that create some sort of response. So we'll see. I mean, the assumption that it's just a statue to Jefferson Davis or Nathan Bedford Forrest. I'm sorry, no, it's not. These things have a lot more symbolic capital than that. Your point about the exclusion of certain voices is so important. I mean, at 9/11, at the 9/11 Memorial and at the 9/11 Museum, it's interesting because, and at the Flight 93 Memorial, it's in terms of how numbers are counted and why things happen, or let's say Oklahoma City. You go to the Oklahoma City National Memorial, and it's just like, 168 people died. Why? Who? It's and we're already losing that memory. My students have no idea. 1995. and quickly losing 9/11, which is interesting. So our refusal to count the murderers among those who died, or even to talk about the stories, is hugely problematic in these spaces of public art. Because, of course, the argument is if you include them, you're giving them power, right? I don't see that we have to look at it that way, but if by not including them, you're certainly opening this up to some mystical act of catastrophe.
It comes back to an issue we talked about last night, and that is at the 9/11 memorial, they're now putting in this museum. And the idea is that the museum's supposed to tell more of the story.
Yeah.
There's two problems. One is simply that the museum itself has all sorts of restrictions on what they're willing to say. They won't say anything that makes the perpetrators of 9/11, in the narrow sense of the people who were using the planes as bombs, anything that brands them as other than murderers. Anything else on them is not permitted. So when you go in, at least in the way it's described, now it's finally open to the public, I think.
No, it's not open yet. May 21.
When you, the way it's described, the pictures of the perpetrators are on the, are in the museum. But they're at an angle where when you're going down, they're small ones though, and you have to turn as you're going down a stair or something like that anyhow. So it's very hard to spend any time looking at them. And then the captions they have under it are completely limited to something that says murderers.
I'm surprised they even included that.
Yeah, I think that was
I'm really surprised.
And does it say murder?
Something equivalent to that, or I forget the exact
word
word.
murderer. I mean, I call them, this is an act of murder. I mean, I don't have any problems with that, but I'm surprised that the museum is including this information because they've been they don't on the website. If you go to the website, it's simply horrible acts of terrorism occurred on 9/11, and there were these planes, and they might say there were 19 perpetrators, and they might say that they died, but there's no discussion whatsoever the politics behind it, or if there were politics behind it, or etc. So, which I just think it's really hard to do, but it creates more confusion. And at least all sorts of Americans love this stuff. Paranoid interpretations. A lot of people think that it was a government cover-up, particularly with the Pentagon part. They think the Pentagon was testing out some missiles. And if you don't try to get a story out there with some narrative authenticity, if you will, then you just feed more American paranoia. So I'm surprised to hear that.
No, but the other issue connected with it, and I'll be really brief on this, is that, but I want to hear your response to it, because it goes back to that issue where we were talking about the aesthetic force of a monument on the one hand, and then the political and social content. The museum is supposed to provide that social political, and we've just seen it doesn't. It hedges on that. 20 years from now, it may not, it may be perfectly possible for them to open up the museum and say a lot more of that. That's broader and a little fair. But the question is to whether or not it's part of the memorial or not. The Arad's reflecting absence has a lot of aesthetic force to it, but it doesn't by itself give us much political and social information or content, or even provokes in that direction. So the idea is you add the museum, which is beneath, under the ground of the monument itself. Then finally do you have one single piece of art that actually has this wonderful combination of aesthetic force and social and political content, or no? Because it looks at times like it's just tacked on and really not part of the monument.
Yeah.
And that even goes back to the Vardo, the community stuff. It's part of the meaning of it.
But it's separate.
Yeah.
I consider the two pools in the museum very separate. Arad and the landscape architect he worked had nothing to do with the interior of the museum. The museum has been a really fraught project separate in terms of the big scope, in terms of how much space they were all taking up and shared space and all that stuff. There's some cooperation there, but no, I see these very, very different. In the same way, for example, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is now going to be added on with a Vietnam Visitors Center, and that is supposed to be dedicated in 2015. And what this is an underground 35,000 square foot museum, which will now interpret the war and provide the historical component that's missing in the memorial. Well, I mean, we've already had some sneak previews of what that's going to be. There will be little or no discussion of student protest or protest in general. There will be little or no discussion of all sorts of things, Gulf of Tonkin, etc. It's going to be, it's a revisionist account of the war. So I tend to see them very separately, and interestingly enough, often created at different historical moments. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the museum. I have a student writing on presidential libraries right now, and the Nixon Library, for example, has dramatically changed its exhibit of the Watergate tapes in interesting ways, which don't do well for Nixon, but then, they're trying, so things can change. Yeah?
I have a question regarding symbolic vandalism. So, do you consider symbolic vandalism, does it need to be framed from the perspective of the person committing the vandalism and his intentions, or can it be perfectly just interpreted as symbolic vandalism, not because of the intentions of the vandal, but because of the reactions of the public? So, do you know of any instance in which a monument has been vandalized with no symbolic intention by the vandal, but still the public reacts in a way that becomes symbolic?
Sure. I think the majority of vandalism is going to be done by drunk, completely, I don't even want to say that they're bad. It's just people acting out in public under the influence, and sometimes people interpret that on political levels, okay? Wait, I was just, taking this hammer and crashing down on this memorial. I just had a hammer in my hand, that kind of thing. So that happens all the time. I think people can read symbolic vandalism into unintentional, I don't want to say unintentional, but intentional acts with no political consciousness. But then on the other hand, even if you're drunk, why'd you pick that statue? Why didn't you pick that car? Et cetera, et cetera. There has to be some sort of guiding force. By reverse, I think a lot of times people will read a symbolic act of vandalism as something nothing more. Like the one I have here, okay? That's just drunk kids writing words. Let's get rid of the word slave owner and go back to life as usual, right? Not paying any attention whatsoever to the symbolic vandalism that is trying to be generated here. So, because ultimately I think what the vandal would want, it would be the removal of this piece, or some sort of conversational setup that would allow us to have a bigger conversation about who Jeff Davis was. And there's so many different ways to do this. I can't remember in the big paper if I talk about what's going on in the campus at the University of Mississippi. No?
I don't think so.
Okay, so on the campus of the University of Mississippi is a Civil War Confederate Memorial. But just a couple of years ago, I can't even remember his name, they put up a memorial to, who was the first African-American student to attend Ole Miss? Medgar Evers. Is that right?
No, James Meredith.
Thank you, James Meredith. James Meredith. And it's an interesting memorial in that here's your Civil War statue. And then about 50, 60 feet away is the statue of James Meredith. And it shows him walking, okay, as if he were walking up the steps or walking on the campus. And it's in a sort of gazebo area with seats. So it's meant to be this conversational, contemplative space. And it's worked pretty well in trying to inspire a conversation. I like to imagine, late at night, a conversation between those two figures talking to one another. It was recently vandalized a couple of months ago, and this became a big deal. I watched the videos and I grabbed some slides off of a website. Vandalism wasn't much. They tracked it down to 3 idiot freshmen from Georgia, who I don't even know what they did because they were so ashamed of the vandalism of the James Meredith statue that they had people coming out and saying, we love our statue, we are not the past, we believe in civil rights, diversity is us. I was like, whoa, talk about a changed campus, at least from the media representation there, okay? I was kind of impressed because it's that statue then that evoked those kinds of responses by people protesting the drunken Georgia students' vandalism. I was, wow, that's pretty interesting. So I have no idea how I got there. Yes?
Yeah, it seems to me like there's a conversation to be had, and you kind of an undercurrent of what you're talking about, which is the idea of aesthetic quality. Because I feel like public art, and especially as it comes to kind of be represented by memorials, you've got this intersection of history and cultural propaganda and aesthetics. And it seems to me like most of the ones you've been holding up, the pieces you've been holding up, kind of offer a springboard. So both something that happened in the past, but a way to unfold into the future. Right, so you can reinterpret the thing about the slavery in France into what's going on today and probably what's going to go on for a long time. So it seems to me there's this conversation we had about the aesthetic and artistic quality of the piece.
Absolutely.
And, because on one hand I see that slave owner, it's like, yes, we all know that. Like, that's an idolized statue, statue that only takes one figure in time. You can do that with any statue, JFK or Martin Luther King. You can talk about the infidelity and all the other things about the personal character that aren't represented by that statue. But a statue like that is never, to me, going to be able to speak both to a past, and it's a symbol that becomes sort of encapsulated in its
Wouldn't
time.
it be interesting if we had a Doho Sue right next? He was the one who did the slave table on the campus of University of North Carolina, that polished table with the people are holding it up. It would be interesting. I'm not an artist, so for me to imagine these things is often ridiculous. But let's say we replicate this, but at the base you've got, there's so many ways to create a conversation that don't entail removal, destruction, reciting. I'm actually so much more interested in people who come up with responsive projects. One of my favorite artists is Sam Durand, D-U-R-A-N-D, who works out of Cal Arts. And he's got these never realized projects, which are all about what he calls transpositions. So he would take all the Indian memorials and then all the white people memorials. So Indian memorials about slaughters of white people, they're all the same. And then memorials, Minnesota, Oklahoma, etc., how many white people were slaughtered. And they all look the same. They all look like obelisks like this, right? Sort of cut off. And then he would put them all along the reflecting pool on the National Mall. And then, there would be white Indian memorial, Indian slaughter memorial, back and forth, back and forth. And I think that's so clever because there are literally hundreds dotted all over the country. Bring them all together and have a national conversation about victims and martyrs and settler colonialism. Of course, none of this has been realized, but at least he's thinking about it in sort of a monument, anti-monument kind of way.
Along those lines, it's interesting. The monument that I talked about last night in your book, Little Bighorn, we were talking about at one point, where you have the Custer, pro-Custer statue, and then many years later, this other one that's put up for American Indians as a response to it. And then, at the same time, let's see, there was another example that goes exactly the opposite direction I was going to think of, and I'll put it aside, but that's a good example, I think, of what you're talking about, where it's processual.
Absolutely. So the Indian Memorial, in 1876, you've got the Little Bighorn battle. Just, terrible defeat for Custer. Nevertheless, it becomes called the Custer Battlefield, and they put up a gigantic obelisk with the names of all of Custer and the guys. Indians are like, are you kidding? We won this one. So finally, in 1991, President Bush said, we're going to rename the battlefield to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, and we're going to make an Indian memorial to the Indian victors. And I have huge problems with this victor-victim kind of thing. But nevertheless, they put up a big Indian memorial, and that was dedicated in 2003 or so. It took quite a while. And it's interesting because part of this was you may not touch the Custer obelisk. So here's the Custer obelisk on a hill, and then here's the Indian memorial, sort of a sunken kiva-like space. But then there's this opening, and you look out on it. So there's an interesting dialogue. And people go to both. And Indians come for annuals, lots of ceremonies, and then leave bags of sage and other things on the fence that is the memorial, as they simultaneously tolerate the obelisk, which they had not been tolerating. There were a lot of AIM American Indian movement protest and even an effort to dig it up in the 70s and 80s. So now you've reached this sort of expansive conversation about American Indians.
Word goes the other way now came back to mind.
Okay.
And that's Maya Lin's Vietnam War
Right.
Memorial. And then we had the more conservative view of that war where they built this more traditional type of statue.
Sure.
They at least had some racial variety in it. They had, I think, one black soldier, one Latino soldier, and one white soldier. But it's a traditional monumental type of and completely
Right.
different.
And they didn't have any women, so then we had to do the Vietnam Women's Soldier Memorial. And then there were people talking about, well, we need the dogs, and I'm not being snarky, but literally, it sort of spins off.
It's the problem that, I mean, I like this idea of that notion of processual, particularly the Indian Memorial we were talking about
Yeah.
right now. And I started thinking of these others, and I think if everyone keeps adding on, then the aesthetic force that you were talking about earlier, that may get dissipated.
Yeah, and Maya Lin was upset. She was a young person, but she was upset that it might detract. It doesn't, because her memorial is so powerful, and this thing's over there in the trees, and the women's memorial's over here, and then there's a flagpole. This is what it remains about. People pose for photos at the three fighting men statue, but this remains the most powerful one. So ultimately, it worked out.
How will we do against that museum when they put it in?
I don't know. I think it's interesting because I thought, oh my God, where is it going to be? Is it in the triangle space? It's somewhere between the memorial and the Lincoln Memorial. So I think it's a distance. I'm hoping it has nothing to do with my aesthetic
It
experience.
does come up that question resistant. Will it be able to resist these other more, what I call
Already the
types of
memorial is unable to resist the new conservative or simply politically changed. When we began the war in Iraq, and there were peace protests, or protest against the war rather, in Washington, this paranoia, gossip went around that people were going to go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and spatter it with red or paint. So the group that does the motorcycle thing every May, every Memorial Day, came out and defended our memorial against those anti-war scumbags who were protesting the new war. And you just kind of go, it makes your head hurt, right?
Yeah.
So,
Speaking of the Vietnam Memorial, has that ever been vandalized?
sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but not by these guys protesting the war in 2004.
Okay, I mean, like
There has been nothing major, nothing of the kind of slave owner vandalism that we're seeing here. Most of it seems to be, I'm not even that sure about what kind of vandalism. Very modest. No breaking, chipping, maybe somebody throwing a can of beer kind of thing. I don't know of any even spray painting.
because I could see it going two directions.
Me
I could
too.
see sort of one, 58,000 American names on the wall, plus 1.5 million Vietnamese,
Sure,
Cambodians,
sure.
Laotian.
I have
And
not
then
seen that.
The other thing I could see is someone like taking spray paint or crayon or something like, circling a name saying "Love you, Dad" or something like that. So, but you're not sure what the nature of it is.
Sorry. No, none of that. No.
The Joe Paterno statue, by the way.
Yeah.
There was, I don't believe there was ever any official explanation
For the removal of the sculpture?
but they sort of leaked out some unofficial ones.
Yeah.
One of which was that the statue was going to be vandalized. That people were going to write, pedophile on it, or it was going to become a rallying cry for people from other schools, like when they come to visit Penn State for football games, they were going to sort of make mocking.
Yeah.
That it was going to become a mockery. So that was sort of one of the unofficial
Yeah.
reasons that was leaked out about
That's
why it was-
interesting. I hadn't heard that. And there's so many other remainders. I mean, it's still Paterno Library, right?
Right.
There are names, and he is there, but they removed that.
But I think,
I
they were,
think-
with good reason, they
Sure.
probably were concerned it was going to become vandalized.
I think they removed it because they were afraid that it was being idolized in ways that they now really wanted to get off campus and get this thing over with and come to closure. Not that they'll ever actually be able to do that, but I mean, I have these photos at the moment that they were taking it down of just hundreds of people crying and all sorts of flowers and things. So, it was a little strange. So.
Two other real quick. Okay. One is by 1989, the Berlin Wall had become sort of a work of art, and it had become like a public billboard for just whatever. And And that was, I mean, that was a true grassroots movement. That was down in days, or certainly, you know, they need some bulldozers here and there.
Much of it, not
Much of
not
it,
even
but then-
much of it. Some of it.
some
It
of
is
it.
one big wall.
Some of it. But then it was eventually all just torn down symbolically.
Right.
And I don't know if they saved any.
Yeah.
They saved some
They
pieces.
saved, okay,
You
okay.
cannot even get that close.
Yeah.
Now it's protected.
Okay.
Yeah. Lots of it was saved and it ends up in museums and
I got a piece
Washington.
2 years later. It was still, you know, you could do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very big, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go
I'm
ahead.
interested in that same sort of point about like the. It's interesting. There seems to be like a safety. Like there's I think almost a fear of politicization in terms of some. And I'm thinking about more of the creation of kind of public art now. And I was just and I don't remember what happened. There was a. I think it was in Serbia. There was a commission. They wanted to commission a public statue. There's this huge debate about what to have, and the question about idolization came up, and people were like, no, we can't have this. It's going to say something about nationalism, and this is going to cause conflict. And they ended up putting up a statue. They're like, we have money. We have to make a statue, so we're going to put something here. And they ended up with like I think a statue of Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris or something like that because they couldn't come up with an idea that wasn't. They were worried about getting vandalized or so they had to come up with something that was completely apolitical. And I'm wondering if you see that as sort of like a trend where there's in the commission of public art because there's so much of a fear of any sort of political conversation
not
that
that
it closes
Bruce
it.
Lee would be
Yeah.
right. But let's just put up a blank something or other
Right.
or whatever. Absolutely. I mean, I've been in public art commissions and I've served on public art committees. And for me, this is all very interesting. I have no idea what that is. And very exciting. But for other people, it's the kiss of death. I mean, when I wrote my first book on public art, I recounted the story of just close this. I recounted the story of trying to create a public art project in Boulder, Colorado, and the mayor, and this would be controversial and interesting, but it would be exciting because Boulder's an exciting place, and the mayor said, I don't want hundreds of people in these chambers being controversial and talking about controversial public art. In other words, this was way too much democracy for her to be able to handle. So they opted for pretty safe. And pretty safe these days means abstract, non-figurative, maybe some animals, although that can be problematic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yet it doesn't matter because you can turn it into whatever political you
Right.
want, which is the fun of it all. So, or even the most benign stuff becomes political.
All right.
So, anyhow, it's fun. Thank you for the information, Alexandria. I have a girlfriend who lives there. We will now go find it. They travel with me, and we find things all over the country. So it's amazing how many memorials, monuments, public art are out there. My students always say, "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no memorials in my hometown." Yeah, go find some.
We have across from the Andy Warhol thing. There's the Fairly. It's Fairly, right? The guy who was the public artist with Banksy and that whole sort of genre. He's got a Andre the Giant face up there.
Oh yeah. And I thought you had an Alice Aycock here, but I haven't been able to track it down, so I must have gotten you mixed up with another city. You have a lot of public art. You have one of those Louise Bourgeois' eye things. I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
But
It's in the center. No, it's in the downtown.
But it hasn't been
Culture
vandalized.
district.
So,
Yeah.
it's still got its brown.
No one knows it's valuable.
It's right across from the magnolia tree. That's a sculpture. So in the winter, it looks like you have magnolias.
Oh, interesting.
That's kind of a neat one.
Cool. All right, well, I think we're probably about done, and now I have to run and try to figure out what the hell Delta is doing in my life. So, thank you.